Okay, good evening again, everyone. Ricardo Miller, and I work at the National Environment and Planning Agency. I'm the coordinator for fauna at NEPA, which means, I have responsibility for conservation of our protected species or endangered species and so forth in terms of writing management plans and putting those management plans into action. One of the key roles I do at NEPA is actually working on the game birds management. And this research is actually coming out of the game bird management section. So my topic today will be a preview of satellite telemetry studies of white-crowned pigeons in Jamaica. And this is done in partnership with NEPA and the Avian Research and Conservation Institute, ARCI. And I'll talk more about them in a little bit. But how did we get here? How did we get here? Well, it all started with the game birds. We have an annual hunting season that runs around August to September for 6 weekends. We know that there are 4 game birds that are being hunted, including the one that we are going to be talking about today, which is the white-crowned pigeon. And you can see pictures of the other 3, the mourning dove, the white-winged dove, and the zenada. Now, there is annual population surveys that are conducted before the start of a hunting season. We started this very intensively in 2002. And it continues today. We have harvest data from the hunters. And so we know how many birds approximately are being taken. And so these are important tools to manage the game bird population. And you see some graphs here that I pulled from reports over the years showing that we know how many birds are being shot each weekend, what's the ratio. The blue, for example, in those graphs is the white-crowned pigeon, and it's just about 1/3 of the number of birds shot. On average, close to about 80,000 birds are shot each year. And that might sound like a lot. Through the Game Birds Management Program, we have an online Game Birds portal for the hunters to use to help manage this hunting data. And through the management plan itself, we've commissioned studies. And this is one of those studies that has come out of the management plan. We want to look at the movement of these birds, the habitat they're using, because that is very important as it pertains to management. Now, the target bird, the white-crowned pigeon. Why is it we are looking at the species? Well, first and foremost, it is a threatened species. The white-crowned pigeon is listed under IUCN, International Union for Conservation in Nature, as near threatened. It is hunted throughout its range, well, most of its range, and you can see a range map there showing that it's really a Caribbean species. It's really just on the Caribbean coast in parts of Central America, you'll find it, and in the Florida Keys, you'll find it. It doesn't get into mainland USA at all. So it has a very restricted range. Now, the questions we have are, where do these birds go? What times of year do they go there? How long do they spend there? And the age-old question, do they migrate to and from Jamaica? If you listen to some hunters out there, they will tell you that this bird migrates. You can't convince them otherwise. But as far as we know, there is no evidence that this species migrates in and out of Jamaica. Maybe there's an accidental one that turns up from a neighbor like Cuba, but there's no known migration that occurs. And this study would actually help to answer some of these questions. I'd like to add that the white-crowned pigeon actually migrates in other sections of its range. For example, in Florida Keys, they've been known to migrate into the Bahamas and even down to Cuba. Now, I'll talk a little bit about the partnership that we have. NEPA, through the Game Bird Program, got in touch with the Avian Research and Conservation Institute, ARCI. And this wasn't a random meeting, because I met Dr. Ken Mayer, who is the head of ARCI, back in about 2004 when he came looking for a white-crowned pigeon that he tagged in the Florida Keys. And back that time, they never used satellite transmitters, but actually radio transmitters. And so he was on the island with handheld receivers trying to detect the birds, and they even attached them to small single-engine Cessna planes and did transects across the island trying to detect if any of the birds make it down to Jamaica. They've already detected them in Cuba, and they've detected a few in the Bahamas, but they didn't find any here. And that is where a partnership started, because we know that that is a question we wanted to answer here in Jamaica. Do our birds migrate? And so it took us another 10 years before we actually cemented that partnership. But a little bit more about ARCI. They were formed in 1997, a small team of researchers, primarily Dr. Ken Mayer and Gina Kent. And Gina is the field person. Notice she's looking up in the sky, she's looking for birds. She is hardcore, believe me. It's a small team of researchers, and they are one of the pioneers in terms of white-crowned pigeon tracking. And they pretty much started with radio telemetry, and now they're at satellite telemetry. And this is a quick look at some of the work they've been doing in the Bahamas, not the Bahamas, sorry, in the Florida Keys, and you can see they've detected a bird in Cuba. Now, let me talk about the technology, and I'll be quick about this. The transmitter is called the Argus, and it's a 5-gram solar transmitter. It's manufactured by that company. It's the second smallest transmitter they actually produce, and it uses the Argus satellite constellation. And you probably need to read up on the Doppler effect and the Doppler shift, and that is how they use triangulation to actually find the position. And the position are actually ranked. Each data point that we get is ranked in terms of quality, and that's what we call location class. So if it's really good quality data, it is given LC3. It's given that 3. Poor quality data is 1. In other words, we're not so sure about the exact location. It's a wider range. Though the transmitter operates on various cycles. Right now we're using 8 hours on and 20 hours off. That's what it looks like. And you can see in the top left, those are some of the transmitters that are made by the company. The second smallest one there, the Argus 5G, is the one we're using. And we have to use that because our birds are not very big birds, and we don't want to attach something that is more than 3% of their body weight. The life expectancy of this transmitter is about 4 to 5 years. But if you check the website, it says 2 years, but we've already had birds living up to 5 years with these transmitters. And they are ridiculously expensive. We're looking at $3,450 US per transmitter. And then there's a subscription fee for the data, which runs you anywhere from $60 to $100 per month. So we're talking about $500,000 Jamaican per bird. Now, let's talk about the pigeons and the research. Our questions, quickly. Seasonal movements and destinations. Those are some of the things we want to know. Where are these birds going, right? When do they go? We want to know about survivorship, annual breeding efforts. We want to know about habitat associations and home range areas. And this number 3 is very important, especially for management here at NEPA, because we also, in the game bird management system, we have a series of protected areas called game reserves. And so we want to know, are these game reserves correct? Are we protecting the right areas for these birds? Or is it just a shot in the dark and we say, okay, no shooting there? We are not sure, but we want to be scientific about our approach at all times. And so this information would help us to narrow down exactly where the birds are using, how long they're there, what time of year they're there. And we also want to look at things like the threats, where they overwinter and so forth. And then, of course, we want to be able to share this information with you, with the rest of the world, with the rest of the scientific community. Now, to attach satellite transmitters on these white-crowned pigeons, we first have to catch them. And believe me, that is something easier said than done. And this is Gina and I setting up mist nets. And that's the principal way we catch birds. We use mist nets. So we set up poles, and these are special mist nets that Gina brings down from Florida with her. And we would put it up to about 30 feet. It's fairly high. It's much higher than mist nets that I've used before. So we put them fairly high because white-crowned pigeons fly fairly high. And as you can see in the picture on the right, we have a lot of bycatch. That's a Jamaican oriole being taken out of a net. So we spend all day trying to catch these white-crowned pigeons, and most of the times they fly right over the top. And we get a lot of birds that we don't really want to work with. But eventually, we do catch a white-crowned pigeon. And Here you can see Gina and I again working on a white-crowned pigeon. First we put on a little hoodie over the face to, you know, cover the eyes to calm the bird down, because white-crowned pigeons, believe it or not, are very delicate. They are very delicate. They can literally drop dead in your hands. You know, they are one of the most delicate birds I've ever handled. And if you look on the picture on the left, you can see some feathers already. That is what we call stress molting. It literally is dropping feathers without us trying to pluck it out. The feathers are just falling out because the bird is so stressed. It's called stress molting. So we have to work with the bird fairly quickly. We have to work fairly comfortably. And of course, we want to work accurately. Here we actually went into the vehicle, turned the AC on, get it nice and comfortable, and worked on it. And we attached the transmitter. And if you notice, the transmitter actually has a little solar pack. So it's the Argus 5G solar. So when the transmitter is off, it is actually, well, it's always charging once there is sunlight. It's always charging. So that is why it is able to last up to 5 years, because a battery that in that little unit would not last that long. So here's a bird fitted and ready to go. And what we actually did was to attach two transmitters. One is a satellite transmitter, and another one is a smaller radio transmitter that is attached with glue. And with the glue, it is actually a temporary transmitter, because we want to track the birds for the first few hours, because that is the most crucial time. We want to ensure the bird is okay for the first few hours, for the first day or two. So we're able to pinpoint the location with a handheld radio transmitter, radio receiver, and find out if the bird is doing okay. If it's remained in one spot for too long, we're going to start, you know, we're going to have to go in there and look for the bird. We actually encountered a situation like that where it so happened that the transmitter fell off, the small glued-on transmitter. And I was so impressed with Gina, because after searching for about an hour, we found that tiny transmitter in a stream in a forest. You have no idea how miraculous that was, actually. And we were able to retrieve that little radio transmitter. But the bird was fine, and it still had on the satellite transmitter, which I didn't point out is actually attached like a backpack. It actually, there are straps that the wings go through, and it comes and forms an X across the chest, and we ensure it's nice and snug, and that will stay on the bird for the life of the bird. There's no way to get it off. So the first bird we caught was in 2014, about 10 years after I met with Dr. Ken Mayer. And this bird, we call him Trelawney. We actually caught two birds, but sadly, by day 2, one of the birds just went offline. It wasn't moving around much when we tracked it, and we left it overnight, and we went back searching for it again, and the transmission just seemed to have been pointing in a wetland somewhere in Falmouth, and it never moved. And so we never got any readings from that bird. So unfortunately, and that's the thing with science, you know, it is a risk. And, you know, it really hurts to know that, you know, about that amount of money and effort actually just went down the drain. But it also teaches us a lesson on how we handle the birds and moving forward to ensure we don't have similar issues. But however, one bird, which we call Trelawney, kept that transmitter on, and boy, did it give us some data. That bird gave us 5 solid years of data. In other words, that white-crowned pigeon survived in one of the heaviest hunting areas on the island, in Trelawney. Trelawney is a massive bird shooting area during August and September. We tagged that bird in February, and it survived for 5 years. And let's look at some of the data it produced. Now, that was just some scattered data there. And as I just mentioned earlier, this is really just a preview, so I'm not getting too deep into the data itself. But for the first 6 months, this is what the bird did, right? You see the dots all over the place. It moved from Falmouth, it went further south a little bit. But looking a little closer, you see that between February and March, it stayed in the mangroves at night and would head south into the hills, down, now let's see what's here, south of Hague Housing Development to forage during the day, and made some trips east and west of Falmouth. That's what it did between February and March. April, it started moving further May, it was somewhere close to the cockpit country. But let us illustrate this. That yellow shape is pretty much where it confined itself in February. It was in that area right around the town of Falmouth, right where we caught it. You can see that red dot is a trapping point. That's where we caught it, and that's where it spent February. And that's where it spent March, the blue area. But by April, it started venturing south. And this was interesting. We really wanted to see that bird make some good movements. And it started venturing south. By May, it is much further south and to the east in an area called Duanvale, just north of the cockpit country. By June, it actually went down into the cockpit country a bit. And so we're realizing now that, you know, the cockpit country, well, not that we didn't know all along, is really important, but we never knew that there was this migration between the north coast and that area for white-crowned pigeons. So there's new information we're getting here. By July, it was very concentrated in that same area. So this was pretty much the first 6 months of tracking that bird. And I will say it again, this is just a preview of the data, because 5 years on, this is what the data look like. Crazy, right? The bird pretty much did the same thing, but it eventually went back to the north coast. But interestingly, it never did it every year. So it's almost like every other year it made the trip to the north coast, which is sort of strange. You figure a migration pattern would be a bit routine, but it spent quite a bit of time down in the south, and then 1 year it said, hey, let me go back to the north coast. We're not sure what is going on. It could be feeding, it could be breeding, we're not sure, but we're going to dig into that data a lot more. Now fast forward, so that first bird, banded in 2014, lasted until January 2019. And I suspect the transmitter failed because we started getting sporadic signals somewhere around October, November, and then the last signal we got was somewhere in January 2019. So I suspect that bird actually survived. I'm sure it fathered, it was a male, I'm sure it fathered quite a lot of offsprings, and it's probably surviving now, who knows? But we at NEPA, you know, things were going on, and we were looking at this data. It was like, we were very astonished. We were looking at, you know, what this bird was doing and said, hey, we need more of these birds. And so we put the idea to the game bird committee at NEPA, because, you know, the hunting season is not free. Hunters do pay to have the privilege to go and hunt these birds. So it is our belief, and it's actually our protocol, it's our mandate, that we should actually put back into conservation from the funds that are generated through hunting. And so we put together a proposal, and we got in touch with ARCI and Gina and Dr. Ken Mayer, and we got funding, and we made another contract period with them. And so Gina came back to Jamaica October 23 to November 1, and we were in the field all this time, and we managed to catch 2 birds. So for that entire week, or just over a week, we caught 2 birds, just to give you an idea how difficult it is to catch these birds. One bird we caught in Clarendon in an area called Mason River, close to Douglas Castle. Leo Douglas should know that area very well. And we caught another bird in Portland, in Port Antonio area, actually on the Bayview Villa property in Port Antonio. And this is what Clarendon and Portland look like. So we nicknamed the birds Clarendon and Portland. And they've been giving us data from last October or November to this day. Now you might see some big movements going on with Clarendon, for example. That's a purple one in the center of your screen. But in reality, we haven't cleaned up the data. This is a raw data that comes in and is plotted on Google Maps. Because if you remember, the data comes with quality information. In other words, not all the data is very accurate. And so those outliers, I suspect, are location class 1, poor signals. You know, poor signal gave us those locations. And so once we look at the data a little closer, we're going to remove all the LC1 and maybe even the LC2 and just use the LC3 data, which is the best quality data, and we'll see really well where the bird spent its time. But if we zoomed in a bit in Clarendon, we actually tagged this bird right at Douglas Castle. If you can see the word Douglas Castle in the middle, Mason River is right just above the word Douglas Castle. And that's where we tagged the bird. And it spent a little time there. And in no time, it went further north into this really good, thick green forest. And that's the same thing we noticed with Trelawney 5 years earlier. It moved from the coastal area to very thick forest for a particular length of time. And then it moved again somewhere else. In this case, for Clarendon, we see it made another big movement and spend some time down in the southeast of where we actually caught the bird. Again, this is just preliminary data. We haven't dig into it really well as yet. We haven't looked at the time periods that it is at various locations. So this is a preview of the work we're doing. But it is very exciting. And the first thing that jumps out is that none of the birds actually left the island, which, you know, we still have a very small sample size. It's just 3 birds, but none of the birds left the island, which is good, because if we're having migration from the island, it changes the entire way how we would manage a hunting season, because we're now dealing with an open population as opposed to a closed population or a semi-open population, because it's still possible that we have resident population and some birds actually come in and go, add to the numbers and leave. It's still possible that that could happen, but I suspect it's highly unlikely. So that is Clarendon. Let's move over to Portland. In Portland, again, we find something very similar. We tagged the bird at Port Antonio, close to Drapers, between Drapers and Port Antonio, at Bayview Villas. And it spent some time there, and then it went south to the John Crow Mountains. Again, very good forested area it went to. And it spent quite some time there. And we haven't gone deep into the data to see what time of year it went there, how long it went there, and so forth. But I have a little sad news. The current status, Clarendon continues to provide regular updates of its location. I get an email every morning at 6 o'clock that tells me where my birds are. It gives me the GPS location, gives me the data, and the quality of the data, all in a package nicely in a file for me every morning. Portland, however, has not given me any data since May, and we're not sure if the bird died or whether the transmitter simply failed. So again, Portland only gave us probably about 7 or 8 months of data, but again, it's important data. And that bird actually went offline in May, which is, again, you know, quite unfortunate. So this is just a preview of what we are doing here at NEPA in partnership with Avian Research and Conservation Institute. We hope to continue this work. We want to deploy more transmitters and more white-crowned pigeons across the island. But again, the cost, I can't say it often enough. It is very expensive. And when it's being expensive like that, it means we cannot do a lot of birds. We can only do, you know, 2 at a time or something like that. But the thing is, what you must always remember is that we are getting consistent data. We're getting data after data. We're not waiting and hoping for data. We're getting data. And that's the important thing about satellite telemetry studies, as opposed to something like bird banding. When you band 1,000 birds, you might, you know, get a hit on 1 or 2 birds over a few years. You know, someone might have a band return to you. But with satellite transmitters, we only need to band just a few birds, and we started to get a good idea of what that bird is doing. And to some degree, we can talk about what the population in that area might be doing. Of course, having more birds tagged is always best. And so that is one of our aims, to get more birds, different parts of the island, so we can understand how the bird movement is happening in Western Jamaica, Southern Jamaica, Northern Jamaica, Eastern. That's the plan. And of course, this we want to maintain as a long-term study. we want to be able to produce some publications, peer-reviewed publications, not little NEPA reports. We want peer-reviewed publications coming out of this work. And that is one of my tasks this year, actually, to this financial year. Between now and March, I should be putting together a comprehensive review of this, look at what information we have so far, especially from the first bird, Trelawney, that gave us 5 years of data, and put together a good report from which we, in partnership with ARCI, of course, we can start looking at producing publications. So those are our next steps. And I would just like to leave with some words from Gina. She mentioned that the white-crowned pigeons are an internationally shared resource. We will succeed if we envision a single population in need of a range-wide conservation strategy. The scale of our collaboration is limited only by the white-crowned pigeons distribution. Thank you. But guess what? There is some exciting work coming in the future. So this is just a quick look, a quick surprise look that Dr. Ann Sutton is actually starting a satellite work on West Indian whistling duck. And that is Ann. That was actually yesterday. Ann Sutton and I were in Falmouth, and we caught these whistling ducks, and we attached a dummy transmitter. That's not a real transmitter. We were just doing the fitting. We wanted, you know, so the whistling duck went to the tailor yesterday, and we are measuring him up and making sure everything fits properly, because the project is actually happening in Negril. But we knew we had a better chance of catching a duck in Falmouth, so we went for it just to do the fitting with that dummy transmitter. And by the way, this is not a satellite transmitter. This is actually a GSM transmitter, so it works with the cell towers. So we'll be getting a different type of information, and I'm actually excited how this transmitter will work. You'll also notice that it's a bigger transmitter than the ones used on the white-crowned pigeon, because look at the size of that whistling duck, right? And of course, the work being done by Anne is actually a NEPA project coming out of the IWECO project, where she's looking at the Negril Environment Protection Area. We're talking about places around the Royal Palm Reserve and the wetlands around there. She's doing some work in there, and one of the questions she wants to know is, you know, what's happening with the whistling ducks. That is why she's venturing into GSM telemetry. And with that, I would like to say thanks to, well, the team at NEPA and members of the Game Birds Committee, Dr. Ken Mayer and Gina Kent from the Avian Research and Conservation Institute. There are others who've given their support over the years, both financially and their expertise. We talk about Dr. Lisa Sorensen from Birds Caribbean, Dr. Susan Koenig. She was with us on the first venture in 2014 when we caught the birds in Trelawney, because we can't work in Trelawney area without contacting Dr. Koenig. And of course, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service supports the work being done by ARCI, and by extension, the work we're doing here in Jamaica. So thank you, and please, 28 minutes is gone. We'd love to take about 10 to 15 minutes of questions, and I hand it over to you, Keisha, as the host, to manage that. Thank you.
So welcome again, everyone. I see quite a few persons joined after the start. So Ricardo, we have a couple of questions for you. Dr. Douglas is asking you to explain for the audience the significance of the insistence of the Jamaican hunters that the WCPI is migratory. In other words, why do we care about this?
Okay. All right, thanks for that question. So WCPI is I should have mentioned it, that's my abbreviation for white-crowned pigeon. So white-crowned pigeon is WCPI, just easy to write. These hunters have been insisting over the years that the birds migrate, because a lot of these hunters also have, little, boats. They go fishing. They have little yachts and little pleasure boats. And when they're out fishing, they would say, I see this large flock of bald-pate flying across. It must be coming from Cuba. Sometimes they're even on the mainland Jamaica and see birds coming from sea and think they're migrating. But it's not necessarily migrating from another country. Sometimes they just simply fly out and use a different route to come back in. It could be wind currents, who knows? But it doesn't necessarily mean that the birds are migrating. So they have what we'll call anecdotal evidence, which has very small significance in a scientific study. We've made note of their observations, but it is not that significant when we're looking at doing an actual study to answer questions like these. So far we have not seen any indication that our white-crowned pigeons leave the island. The work being done by ARCI shows that they do move from the Florida Keys down into Cuba, over into the Bahamas, but they've never tracked a bird come all the way to Jamaica. And we've never had a confirmation of a bird from Jamaica going to Cuba or vice versa.
Thank you, Ricardo. The next question is from Wendy. Are there any non-game birds that you would be interested in tracking? Parrots, for example, but they would be able to take off the harness. So she's guessing maybe, maybe not.
Okay, that's a very good question. Thank you, Wendy. I'm interested in tracking every bird. There are quite a few species I'm interested in tracking. Plain pigeon, for example, is something I'm really interested in. Parrots, yes, but you've made a good point because those beaks are made for crushing seeds. They're seed predators. White-crowned pigeons, for example, are seed dispersers. They regenerate first because they eat fruits and carry the seeds and drop it to other places. Parrots mostly destroy seeds. They crush them with their bill. And they would make easy work of a transmitter like this, especially since they're so social. If they can't reach it, their friend beside them will actually go and crack that transmitter for them. So putting it on a parrot is not something I know of ever been done. I might be wrong, I stand corrected, but with our current technology that we're using a white-crowned pigeon, we couldn't use that on a parrot, not at all.
Next question is from Wayne. He's asking, how did you catch the whistling duck?
Oh, well, the whistling ducks are actually easy to sort of domesticate. Right across the Caribbean region, wherever they occur, sometimes people find that they come very close to them when they throw seeds or something like that. They have some friends over in the Lesser Antilles, I'm not sure, I don't quite remember which island, where they actually come very close and they feed them. This actually occurs in the Negril Royal Palm Reserve as well, back in the days when the Royal Palm Reserve was operational. And at Falmouth, at the Jamaica Swamp Safari, the crocodile facility, they have some wild animals like pigs, wild pigs and stuff in pens. And when they're feeding these animals, I was talking to the caretaker yesterday, he said one bird appeared about 4 years ago, one whistling duck, and started eating some of that feed. And in a few weeks, another one came. And so now they have probably about 30 that regularly visit the facility. I was there yesterday and I counted about 18 whistling ducks just moving around like chickens, but they're totally wild birds. So what they did was to entice them into a holding area with corn. And so it was very simple. They caught them the day before we arrived. They simply put some corn on the ground and led it into a little holding area. And they went in and they closed the door. And so it was very easy. That is why we use that as a test bed to fit the transmitter. I don't think we're going to be that lucky in Negril where the project is going to be done. And so, we're going to have to be ingenious when we get there. All right.
Next question. Thanks, Ricardo. Hannah is asking, are the white crowns territorial because she's not seeing much overlap between the birds that you were tracking, and it will be interesting to evaluate their habitat preferences.
Oh, well, most birds are territorial, but the data I displayed just now wouldn't give any information about territorial because it was just one bird being tracked in a particular region. And so the shape files that I was showing is just where it was a particular time of the year. And you saw a lot of overlaps. That bird was staying in one place and then it moved to another area. But the other two birds, we deliberately went to far away areas just to get a wider spread on the island in terms of the birds we're tracking. We wanted something in Western Jamaica, something in Central Jamaica, and something in Eastern Jamaica. The white-crowned pigeons, are not that territorial. In the Florida Keys, for example, they would nest in fairly large colonies in the mangroves. We don't get that colony style nesting in any one area, but in the deep forest, the concentration can get fairly large. That's what we're suspecting is happening down in Duan Vale and parts of the cockpit country where that bird actually went, the bird from Falmouth actually went. We figured it went down there to actually, conduct breeding activities. So there is some amount of territorial behavior, but not that much with white-crowned pigeons. And they tend to move in flocks sometimes, so not really.
Next question is from Javon. Javon is asking, can interested university students take part in this research?
Yes, yes, and yes. We are always looking for partnerships with the university. The Game Birds Committee at NEPA, for example, is a very diverse group. It is written that there should be the member of the committee should comprise university representative. We had someone from the University of the West Indies for a while, and now we have someone from the University of Technology on it. It also comprises a member from BirdLife Jamaica, someone from the hunting fraternity, and different parts of NEPA such as enforcement, public education, legal, and of course the ecosystem branch where I'm located, which will deal with research. And it's interesting to ask a question because that is actually how I started at NEPA. I started as a research student back in 2002, looking at game bird populations on the island. So my research question with Dr. Peter Vogel when he was alive was to look at the game bird populations on the island. Again, a project out of the Game Bird Committee, which he was a part of as a member of the university. And so he brought me on as a student. I did my studies for 3 years. And out of that study, we produced the Game Bird Management Program as it is now in NEPA, where we have annual population surveys before we declare a hunting season, so as to put some science behind what we're doing and to look at new research ideas such as what I just presented.
Okay, the next question is actually my question. So pardon me, Leo, I'm skipping you. You said you used LC3 data. What's the difference between LC1, 2, and 3? And why is it that you prefer to use the LC3 data?
Okay, so all the data that comes back from the satellite is ranked. It's a position data, just like your GPS. If you ever use your GPS on your phone, it will tell you that accuracy is 10 meters. So it's a level of accuracy. So LC1 is the lowest accuracy. So it's accurate to say, I think LC1 is 1,500 meters accuracy. So that's 1.5 kilometers. LC2 is somewhere around 700 or 500, I believe. And LC3 is less than 250 meters in terms of accuracy. So we always want to use LC3 as much as possible, especially when we're looking at small movements in an area like this. If this bird was doing intercontinental movements from North to South America, we could use LC3 all the way because a difference of 1 kilometer, LC1 all the way, because a difference of 1 kilometer would not be much in the grand scheme of things. But the smaller your area that you're actually surveying, the more accurate information you want to use overall. So that is why I would say I want to clean up the data and use only LC3, location class 3, the highest quality data for my work that I'm doing, because it gives me the best accuracy. And you saw on those maps, some of those points were way out at sea. Somewhere, look as though the bird went, 10 kilometers away just for 1 minute and came back, which the bird didn't actually do. So yeah, that is why we want to use LC3. Keisha? Anyone hearing me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, you're back on now. We lost you for a second. But
okay.
Subsidiary question. Now that you're going to a GSM transmitter, will the area of accuracy be smaller than the 250 meters?
To be honest, I do not know much about this. This is actually Anne's work that I just gave a little sneak peek. You know, Anne is actually did her research and figured that that is probably the best transmitter for her work. And the fact that Jamaica has a fairly good cell tower concentration, I think that's a good selection because it also cuts back on cost. You can use a bigger transmitter, which in this case actually means less money. So I'm not sure about the accuracy, to be honest, but I'm pretty sure it's suited for the work that she's doing.
And I see that you're on the call. You want to take the question? You're talking to mute.
And, you know, I invite anyone who wants to know more about these transmitters to visit the manufacturer's website. The manufacturer is Microwave Telemetry Incorporation. So Microwave Telemetry. If you Google search for Microwave Telemetry, you'll learn all about these transmitters. They started with really large transmitters, and now, you know, the technology has brought them down to 2-gram transmitters. And the one I used was actually the 5-gram transmitters. I see Anne is ready to talk.
Yeah, I'm ready to talk, but I don't have the answer. We're just still, we haven't started mobilizing these yet. So I'm not quite sure what the answer is yet, but yes, it will probably be less than 100 meters, I think.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Leo again. He's asking Ricardo if applications have been made to Birds Caribbean for funding through the Betty Peterson Conservation Fund, as they provide grants of up to US $135,000 for this kind of work. He said the Black Cap Petrel folks used a similar grant to fund their research work.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, and I'm sure Gina and Dr. Miller would love to also capitalize on that opportunity. We at NEPA would love to use it as well, but the trick is sometimes we want these things to be standalone projects. Right now, it's really just one task on my work plan, you know, which is filled with many tasks. And if Javon was a person who asked about partnerships with university students, that is where we would love to have, for example, a dedicated project out of this and a university student working on it, getting their paper while they're doing it. And in that way, we can actually apply for extra funding because we know it's a dedicated project. I am always a little reluctant to go looking for extra funding when I know I don't have the extra time, you know? So, but we are always looking. And of course, I'm sure ARCI would love to capitalize on that as well.
Next question. From Leo again, it's a more general pigeon question. He says, St. Vincent parrots have been seen feeding on ficus trees and fruit alongside with their scaling-necked pigeons. And he's wondering if you or others have observed the white-crowned pigeons feeding with Jamaican parrots.
I can't say I specifically have seen it. Even when they leave, she's still here. Mike can give some information on whether she's observed that in her Stewarttown area. I can't say I've actually seen it, but I wouldn't be surprised if it does occur. You know, we're always so excited to see parrots. When we see parrots, we zone out every other bird. So I can't answer that question right now, Leo.
Actually, Leo, I haven't seen them side by side, not anything, but I've been countless times in the Stewarttown area and seen parrots and also white-crowned pigeons, you know, in more or less the same area of forest. I have seen other feeding combinations, like I've seen orioles feeding with rufous-tailed flycatchers, and the orioles poke and pry, and something flies out, and the flycatcher grabs it. So I've seen those pairs moving along. But I haven't seen parrots and bald-pates.
Thanks, Wendy.
Okay.
Next question, Ricardo, from Paul. Paul is asking, do the birds migrate between islands or within the islands, or is that also anecdotal? There are times we see and hear them and other times they don't. And he's speaking of what his experience is in the Stony Hill area.
Okay, I see he was actually talking more about white wings.
Yeah.
None of our game birds that we know of migrate from the island, but we suspect there is a lot of intra-island migration that takes place, evidenced by what we're seeing here with this, small amount of data from these white-crowned pigeons. And white-winged doves actually do move quite a bit within the island itself, and they move in large flocks. I've seen a flock of over 6,000 white wings in one go. One large flock of about 6,000 white wings in St. Catherine. And, they must have come from somewhere. They must have gathered from other parts close by and made their way over there. And I wouldn't be surprised if they came all the way from Kingston in some instances. But no, not from the island, but within the island, definitely.
Thanks, Ricardo. We have a few more minutes. We'll take another question or two. Any other questions? Okay, I have one. So ARCI saw the birds from the Keys, Florida Keys, come to Cuba, come to Bahamas.
Right.
We're seeing our birds go from Jamaica, anywhere off island. Do you think it's a specific reason why that doesn't happen? And their Florida counterparts move around?
Well, I think Jamaica has everything you need. I mean, we have reggae, we have good food. But seriously though, the Florida Keys is really more of a roosting area and feeding area for the parrots. And the Bahamas, for example, it's really just an international boundary, and they don't see an international line. So, the Bahamas is right there next door, and so they easily go over. Cuba is also fairly close, and so they make their way to mainland Cuba. They don't go into mainland Florida. But my guess is that once they're on mainland Cuba, they pretty much have what they need. They don't need to come further south to Jamaica. But when they're ready, they'll go back to the Florida Keys to breed and to make use of the feeding in the black mangroves there. But I think our Jamaican birds are just quite contented with where they are. I think that's how it is. I mean, it's questions that need answers, and hopefully the more we look at these birds, the more studies we do, the better we can answer those questions.
Okay, so the birds agree that nowhere better than yard. Here's a go ahead, Brandon.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Hi, Ricardo.
Yes.
Yes, agreeing with you that because of the diversity of habitat that's available here. Remember too that in most of the rest of the range, they actually breed mostly in colonies in mangrove and coastal habitats. And so the Florida Keys and the Bahamas would probably represent more of a breeding type territory, after which they would migrate out into, as they do even in the Florida Keys, they migrate from the mangrove areas where they actually nest and mangrove islets, and then onto the hammock, which is similar to our dry forest type of habitat, and then elsewhere later on after they've matured and fed up a bit. So it's about finding habitat that's suitable for different stages over a wider range the further north you go. But in the Greater Antilles, maybe there is less need for that movement because they can find them within on a single island.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Brandon. Last question from Damien. Is there any chance to look at the phenology in the areas they are visiting?
Okay, so Damien is asking about, I'm thinking the fruiting phenology, the timing of the fruiting of trees to see if the movement of these white-crowned pigeons coincide with fruiting of trees in particular areas. Now, that is one of the next steps I have on the in terms of the research. In the presentation, I spoke about ground truthing. That's one of the next movement, things we want to do. We want to go, these areas where we see the birds are moving, and they're moving there at a particular time. We need to go there at that particular time to see what is happening in the forest that is actually encouraging them to go. We suspect it might be, feeding. They might be taking advantage of, the fruiting phenology. Fruiting might be occurring one particular area at a certain time, and then another area at another time, and they're simply moving with that. But we've also noted that the bird in Trelawney, for example, that gave us 5 years of data, didn't make that north-south movement on an annual basis, because you'd expect more of a rhythm, annual rhythm with fruiting. But that movement north to south, it spent like 2 years down in Duanvale before it went back to the Falmouth. And so, there are more questions being asked than answers we're getting. But I'm pretty sure fruiting phenology plays a part, but there are other things there. So we need to get in there and look at what's happening at certain times of the year, why the birds decide to choose those areas.
All right, so on that note, we'd like to thank everyone who joined the webinar. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Ricardo, for sharing your preliminary work. It was actually quite interesting, and we look forward to regular updates as your study progresses and you have the opportunity to analyze the data and get some inferences from it. Or we'll ask everybody to save the date on December 10th. We intend to have another webinar. Details to follow, so the details will come via email from BirdLife Jamaica as well as in the WhatsApp group. It will be same 7 p.m. so you can save the date in your calendars from now. And once again, we'd just like to say thanks everybody for joining, and thank you, Ricardo, and everybody have a good evening.
All right, thank you. Bye.
All right, thanks, Ricardo. Bye, everyone.
You're welcome.
Hi, Wayne.
Are you still there, Keisha?
Yes, I am.
I see someone asking if the recording can be made available.
Yes, I'm going to make it as soon as I download it. I'll share it both by email and WhatsApp.
Okay, the email and WhatsApp, just as how we gave out this invitation, right?
Yeah. So, Javon, I see you asking, just email your contact information to birdlifejamaica@gmail.com, and we will add you to the WhatsApp group and also have Ricardo talk to you about joining the research program.
Great, great. All right, bye everyone.
Good night, everyone.